The first time someone claims they saw the Emperor walk among men, the story is never told loudly. It is whispered in the margins of after-action reports, buried in half-burned data slates, or muttered by soldiers whose eyes no longer focus quite right when the battle is over. There are no banners unfurled in those moments. No choir announces his arrival. Instead, the war simply changes texture. Fear recedes just enough to be noticed. Orders feel lighter in the mouth. And for a brief, terrible instant, men and women who have spent their lives dying for an idea begin to wonder what would mean to fight for something that stands beside them instead of above them. The Imperium teaches that the Emperor sits immobile upon the golden throne, sustaining the Astronomican through endless sacrifice. It does not teach what happens when soldiers swear they felt his presence somewhere else entirely, on worlds burning far from Terra, where no custodian stood watch and no official record should exist. Yet those stories persist, resurfacing whenever war grows desperate enough to invite miracles or delusions or something dangerously close to hope. If you value these kinds of stories, the ones Imperium would rather leave unexamined, take a moment now to support this channel by liking the video, sharing it with fellow lore scholars, and subscribing, not to chase myths, but to understand why they refuse to die. The war was already old by the time the first regiments made planetfall, its opening salvos buried beneath weeks of orbital exchanges and failed containment strategies that never reached the public data archives. Officially, the world had been designated salvageable. Unofficially, most projections gave a lifespan measured in months, not because the enemy was unstoppable, but because the cost of stopping them exceeded the value the administratum had assigned to the planet's continued existence. That calculus shaped everything that followed. Troops were deployed not to reclaim ground permanently, but to slow a collapse already underway, to buy time for evacuations, rerouted supply lines, and revise sector defenses elsewhere. Victory was not expected. Delay was. For the Astra Militarum units, sent down through ash-choked skies and flak-heavy approach corridors, that distinction was meaningless. Orders still came. Trenches still had to be held. Lost guns still had to fire until their barrels overheated or their bearers fell. The ground-level war felt no different from any other doomed campaign. Mud churned into slurry by boots and shellfire, command voxnets saturated with overlapping directives, officers making decisions with incomplete information and no margin for error. From the first day, casualty reports climbed faster than replacement schedules could match, numbers blinking red across data slates that no one had time to fully read. Morale should have collapsed early. By every known pattern, it should have. The regiments deployed here were drawn from disparate worlds, many already under strength, some newly raised and inadequately trained. They lacked cohesion, shared history, and in some cases even compatible command doctrines. Ammunition shipments arrived late, rations were cut, medical facilities overflowed, and then failed outright. In the first week alone, entire platoons vanished in night actions that left behind no clear record of what had taken them, the kind of losses that normally broke armies. And yet, the line held longer than projected. At first, this discrepancy was small enough to be dismissed as statistical noise. A defensive position lasting 12 hours longer than expected. A counterattack repelled when simulations had predicted collapse. An enemy pushed delayed just long enough for artillery to reposition. None of it violated doctrine. None of it required explanation. War was variable. Luck existed, at least in theory. It was the accumulation that unsettled those still paying attention. Officers began noting that units reported exhaustion without disintegration. Soldiers continued to advance under conditions that should have forced retreat. Commanders described moments where fear seemed to recede without reason, replaced by a clarity that arrived too suddenly to feel earned. These observations were filed as subjective impressions, flagged but not acted upon. No one wanted to be the first to suggest that something was wrong in a way that could not be corrected with discipline or reinforcements. The enemy, too, behaved strangely. Assault stalled without obvious cause. Momentum faltered in places where numerical superiority should have guaranteed breakthrough. Recon picks showed formations hesitating at critical moments, as if encountering resistance that did not appear on auspex or tactical overlays. Analysts blamed terrain, atmospheric interference, command lag, Each explanation fit well enough to avoid deeper scrutiny. On the ground, soldiers noticed none of the strategic implications. They noticed smaller things instead. The way the air felt heavier just before a successful stand. The way orders seemed to arrive at exactly the moment they were needed, even when Vox traffic elsewhere was chaos. The way wounded troopers found the strength to rise one last time when the line could not afford to thin further. None of this was framed as miraculous. It was framed as necessity made manifest. The war ground on, and by rights, it should have broken the Imperium's grip entirely. It did not. The planet bled, burned, and scarred itself into something barely recognizable. But the timeline refused to accelerate toward total loss. Somewhere between the third and fourth major enemy offensives, a realization began to circulate quietly among those tasked with measuring outcomes rather than surviving them. This war was not behaving like one that wanted to be lost. And that was when the first report stopped describing outcomes and began describing feelings. The first time the phrase appeared, it was buried in the margin of an after-action transcript where no one expected poetry to survive. A lieutenant's report, dictated with fractured jaw and stitched together with pain suppressants that dulled the mind but never quite reached the fear. The report listed ammunition expenditure, casualty estimates, coordinates for a temporary fallback position, and then, almost as if the speaker had forgotten where they were, one additional line. He said the battlefield went quiet for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat he felt watched. Not by the enemy, not by the commissar. Watched the way a child feels watched when they stand at the threshold of something sacred and cannot explain why their voice drops to a whisper. The scribes flagged it as trauma-induced. A note was attached. The lieutenant was reassigned. The line continued. Then another report surfaced. This one from a Vox operator whose job was to translate screaming into structure, to log the desperate flow of orders that poured through command channels whenever the enemy surged. The operator noted that during the worst of the second offensive, when static drowned every frequency and even short-range Vox became useless, there was a voice, not transmitted in any channel he could identify, not distorted by interference. Clear, calm, and close, as if it had spoken from within the operator's own helmet. It gave a single instruction, hold the left traverse now, and then vanished. The operator followed it because there was nothing else to follow. The left traverse held. The operator survived long enough to write the report. The report was sealed under standard morale protection protocols and never entered the public data stream. It would have remained there if the war had ended quickly, if the planet had collapsed into the expected loss, and the Imperium could file the entire campaign under acceptable expenditure. But the war did not end. It resisted ending. And as it dragged on, the small anomalies began to cluster around moments that should have been final. A platoon pinned beneath overlapping fields of enemy fire reported a sudden thinning of pressure at the exact instant their officer decided to advance rather than retreat. A medicae orderly described a stretch of minutes where the wounded stopped screaming, where pain seemed to drop away like a curtain falling. She could not explain it. She only knew that during those minutes, hands steadied enough to apply bandages properly, and blood loss slowed enough for more bodies to be dragged back behind cover. When the moment passed, the screams returned, almost worse for the silence that had preceded them. The orderly wept afterward, and then returned to work, because there was no other option. The soldiers themselves did not speak in strategic terms. They spoke in fragments, traded in the darkness between shelling cycles. A private swore they saw a shape at the edge of a burning half-block, tall and still, not armored like an Astartes and not robed like an ecclesiarch, simply present in a way that made the air feel different. Another said they heard a footstep behind them during a retreat, heavy and deliberate, and when they turned there was no one, only the sudden certainty that if they kept running they would die. So they stopped, they turned, they fired, they lived. A third laughed when asked about it, and said he didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but for a few breaths he knew, absolutely knew, that fear could not touch him. Officers tried to stamp it out, not with punishment, at least not openly, with discipline, with routine, with lectures about the dangers of superstition and the necessity of relying on doctrine rather than sensation. Commissars reminded units that the Emperor protects, yes, but he protects through duty, not through whispers. The lectures did not stop the stories. They shaped them. The stories became quieter, more careful, framed as questions instead of claims. Even those who dismissed the accounts felt the discomfort they created. The Imperium was built to endure horror, but it preferred horror to be predictable. It preferred its metaphysics contained within scripture and sanctioned relics. What unsettled command was not the idea of the Emperor's presence. It was the idea of it appearing where it should not, because if the Emperor walked among men, even as rumor, then the rules of the war changed. Not tactically, psychologically. If soldiers believed they were witnessed by something vast and sacred, they fought differently. They stood longer. They died slower. They made choices that contradicted survival logic, and yet somehow resulted in survival anyway. That was not merely inspiring. It was destabilizing. The planet should have been lost. Every simulation insisted upon it. Every supply table, every casualty curve, every projection stamped with administrative certainty predicted the same outcome. But on the ground, in the mud and smoke where truth was measured in heartbeats, something kept interrupting the pattern. The enemy pressed. The Imperium bled. The war refused to resolve. And somewhere within the noise, a legend began to take shape. Not as a proclamation, not as an official miracle, but as a shared pressure behind the eyes of exhausted soldiers, a question they did not dare speak too loudly. If this is impossible, then why does it keep happening? The realization did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like dust after bombardment, coating everything until it could no longer be ignored. Those still tracking the campaign began to sense a divergence between what was happening and what should have happened, a widening gap that no amount of logistical adjustment could fully explain. The war's tempo felt wrong, not in any single moment, but in aggregate. Too many near breaks that did not break. Too many stands made by units already past the point of functional endurance. Too many survivors where there should have been only wreckage and silence. No formal inquiry was opened. No doctrinal alarm was raised. The Imperium had survived long enough to recognize when question was more dangerous than its possible answers. Instead, the anomalies were absorbed, distributed across departments, diluted by bureaucracy until no single authority held enough of the pattern to name it. The war was allowed to continue. And in continuing, it did what it had begun to do from the start. It generated witnesses. By the time the first phase of the campaign finally ground itself into something resembling stability, the legend was already present in fragmentary form, carried by those who had lived long enough to pass it on. Not shouted, not recorded, simply remembered in the way soldiers remember things they cannot prove but cannot forget. Something had been there. Something had shifted the weight of the war just enough to matter. Whether that something was faith, madness, coincidence, or the Emperor himself was a question no one officially asked. Chapter 1 ended the way the war began, without certainty, without closure, and with the unsettling knowledge that this conflict had produced more than casualties and territory changes. It had produced a story that refused to die, and stories like that, in the Imperium of Man, never remained small for long. The Imperium trusted records more than memory, but it trusted hierarchy more than either. That was why the first people removed from the story were not the ones who spoke most openly, but the ones whose positions made their words dangerous. A Vox operator could be dismissed as shaken. A wounded lieutenant could be reassigned and quietly forgotten. But when officers with intact command authority began submitting reports that deviated from acceptable language, the response became precise and immediate. One such report originated from a regimental commander whose unit had been reduced to less than half strength while holding a manufacturing district slated for evacuation. The document itself was flawless. Clean casualty figures, precise coordinates, doctrinally correct language. Only one paragraph deviated, almost imperceptibly. In it, the commander described issuing an order they could not remember deciding to give. A counterattack, launched against all logic, executed without hesitation, and successful beyond any rational projection. The commander did not attribute the decision to inspiration or courage. They described it as inevitability, as if the order had already been given somewhere else, and they had merely spoken aloud. The administratum flagged the report for internal review. The commander was commended for valor and transferred to a rear planning role where their instincts could be monitored rather than tested. The paragraph was redacted in all official copies. The war continued. Others were less fortunate. A junior officer, barely old enough to have memorized a litany of steadfastness without prompting, insisted during debrief that he'd seen a figure walking the line during an artillery barrage. Not an Astartes, not a commissar. A man, unarmored, unhurried, untouched by the explosions that collapsed the trench behind him. The officer was not hysterical. He did not weep or shout. He spoke with the flat certainty of someone describing weather. The medicae report listed acute stress response. The ecclesiarchy suggested extended penance. The officer never returned to frontline duty. The pattern repeated itself across regiments and ranks, and the Imperium responded the only way it knew how, by isolating variables. Witnesses were separated from one another through reassignment. Units that developed reputations for strange morale resilience were broken apart and redistributed. Survivors were promoted just enough to remove them from the environments where their experiences had formed, but not enough to grant them real influence. The story was not denied. It was diluted. Those without authority felt this instinctively. The enlisted did not try to convince anyone. They had learned long ago that survival depended on knowing when not to speak. Instead, they shared fragments during moments that did not officially exist, while cleaning weapons in low light, while waiting for rations, while standing watch with the sky burning quietly overhead. Each account was incomplete, shaped by fear and exhaustion, but the similarities were impossible to miss. No one agreed on what had been seen. Height varied, shape varied. Some insisted the figure wore armor obscured by light. Others swore there was no armor at all. Some claimed a voice. Others only presence. The details did not matter. What mattered was the effect. The moment when panic receded. The instant when retreat became impossible to imagine. The brief, terrible calm that settled over the battlefield like a held breath. The Imperium had mechanisms for this kind of thing. Entire departments existed to classify belief, to determine when faith reinforced obedience and when it threatened coherence. Commissars were instructed to reinforce doctrine without encouraging speculation. Priests were told to emphasize the emperor's omnipresence without suggesting manifestation. The language tightened. The boundaries were reinforced. And still, the witnesses accumulated, because the war demanded them. Every time the line should have collapsed and did not, someone was there to notice. Every time men and women fought beyond the limits of fear, someone survived long enough to wonder why. The Imperium could suppress testimony, but it could not suppress pattern. The witnesses were not heroes. They were not prophets. They were exhausted soldiers and officers whose only crime was being present at moments when the war behaved incorrectly. They had no authority to speak. But authority was no longer what the story needed. The Imperium learned long ago that belief did not require validation to become dangerous. It required repetition. And repetition was exactly what this war provided. As the campaign stretched on, the witnesses did not diminish. They multiplied, not because the phenomenon grew stronger, but because more people survived long enough to notice it. The pattern emerged not in dramatic proclamations, but in the quiet consistency of accounts that should have contradicted one another and did not. Different regiments, different fronts, different phases of the war. The same pressure, the same momentary stillness, the same sense that something vast had leaned closer to listen. A medicae surgeon, operating for 30 hours without rest in collapsed transit hub, later described the moment she should have failed. Her hands had begun to shake. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. She knew the next incision would be wrong. Then, without warning, the shaking stopped. The pain in her spine vanished. The screams around her receded to a distant echo. For several minutes, she worked with impossible clarity, saving lives she knew she would otherwise have lost. When the clarity faded, the exhaustion returned all at once, leaving her collapsed on the floor, weeping from a relief she could not justify. Her report contained no religious language. It did not need to. The ecclesiarchy marked it for restricted circulation anyway. Elsewhere, a commissar recorded an anomaly they could not discipline away. During a mass retreat triggered by an unexpected enemy breakthrough, one platoon halted without command. Not slowed, not confused. Halted. The commissar prepared to execute the officer responsible, only to find that no order had been given. The men simply stopped. They turned. They advanced. When questioned later, none of them could explain why. They only knew that retreat had felt wrong in a way that made compliance impossible. The Commissar's authority had failed in the face of something older than fear. The report was sealed. The Commissar was reassigned. What unsettled Imperial command was not the suggestion of the Emperor's presence, but the absence of any mechanism to contain the idea once it took hold. Official faith was structured, ritualized, predictable. This was none of those things. It did not arrive through sermons or relics. It arrived through exhaustion and proximity to death. It did not demand worship. It demanded endurance. Attempts were made to redirect interpretation. Priests emphasized that the emperors will move through all loyal servants. That courage was his gift, not his visitation. That clarity under fire was proof of faith properly internalized. These explanations worked. Mostly, they gave language to something already felt, and language made it manageable. But they did not erase the details that refused to conform, because some witnesses insisted on physicality, on presence, on the sense that something had occupied space on the battlefield, even briefly. Not a vision, not a hallucination, something that displaced smoke, that cast a shadow, that altered the flow of violence simply by existing within it. These accounts were the most dangerous, and they were treated accordingly. Witnesses were isolated, transferred, or quietly removed from duty. Some were sent to rear echelon roles where their experiences could fade into irrelevance. Others disappeared into departments that specialized in containment rather than care. None were publicly denounced. That would have given the story weight. Instead, they were erased gently, efficiently, as if they had never mattered. Among the soldiers, the effect was the opposite. Every disappearance reinforced the story. Every reassignment became confirmation. The Imperium's silence was interpreted not as denial, but as caution. If the story were false, why fear it? Why not simply laugh and move on? The witnesses understood something the hierarchy did not. They understood that authority did not determine truth on the battlefield. Survival did. And those who survived long enough to see the pattern knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever they had felt, whatever they had seen, it had wanted them to keep fighting. The story did not spread because anyone wanted it to. It spread because soldiers needed a shape for what they had already felt. No one stood up and declared that the Emperor had walked among them. That would have been blasphemous, or worse, hopeful. Instead, the idea emerged sideways, assembled from fragments exchanged in the narrow spaces where truth survived longest, in trenches between bombardments, in transit holes where exhaustion dulled caution, in medicae queues where pain stripped away the energy required to lie. Each retelling was incomplete, cautious, hedged with uncertainty. But the overlaps were unmistakable. The legend did not describe the Emperor as he appeared in sanctioned iconography. There was no golden radiance, no crown of light, no impossible halo blazing against the smoke. Those details belonged to cathedrals and stained glass, to worlds that still had the luxury of certainty. On the battlefield, the shape was simpler and more disturbing. A man-sized presence where no man should stand. A weight in the air that pressed fear flat without replacing it with comfort. A sense of attention so absolute it felt heavier than artillery. Some described the silhouette half lost in smoke, edges indistinct, refusing to resolve no matter how hard the eye tried. Others insisted they never saw anything at all, only felt a moment when chaos aligned into purpose. In every version, the effect was the same. Panic broke. Movement clarified. Men and women acted with decisiveness they did not recognize as their own. The Imperium had seen legends like this before. Every prolonged war produced them. Saints glimpsed in the ruins. Angels sighted at the edge of Auspec's range. Ghosts of fallen heroes returning to guide the living. Most of those stories burned bright and fast, flaring in the desperation of a single campaign before fading into localized myth. This one did not behave that way. It refused to attach itself to a name. No regiment claimed ownership. No world declared the vision theirs. There was no relic, no fixed location, no moment that could be enshrined and controlled. The story was mobile, appearing wherever the war pressed hardest, wherever collapse hovered just close enough to be inevitable. That made it resilient. You could not suppress what had no center. Attempts were made, quietly, to redirect the narrative. Ecclesiarchal representatives emphasized approved saints associated with endurance and sacrifice, encouraging soldiers to frame their experiences within known devotional structures. Commissars reminded units that courage was expected, not miraculous. Adeptus administratum briefs warned against the spread of unverified morale phenomena that could disrupt unit cohesion. The legend adapted. It shed specific claims and retained effect. It stopped asking to be believed and began operating as assumption. You did not say the Emperor was there. You said the line felt different that day. You did not describe a figure. You said fear had nowhere to stand. The language shifted until denial became difficult without sounding dishonest. What truly unsettled command was not the persistence of story, but its utility. Units exposed to the legend fought harder, not recklessly, but with a grim certainty that reduced hesitation at critical moments. Retreats were delayed. Counterattacks launched under conditions that should have broken morale, instead stabilized it. The story did not make soldiers fearless. It made fear irrelevant. In a galaxy where morale was as valuable as ammunition, this presented a dilemma the Imperium had no doctrine for, because legends could be weaponized. But legends that could not be controlled could also turn. And somewhere between belief and necessity, the shape of the story began to harden, not into a miracle, but into expectation. If the Emperor had walked among men once, even as rumor, then he might do so again. And if he did not, then what did that absence mean? Once expectation took root, the legend stopped belonging to the witnesses and began belonging to the war itself. Soldiers no longer waited for signs. They assumed presence, the way one assumes gravity or recoil. Not something you look for, but something you account for. The shift was subtle and dangerous. Belief hardened into posture, into timing, into decisions made without consultation. Men held positions longer not because they hoped to be saved, but because it felt unthinkable that the line would fail where it had not before. This was where the Imperium's unease deepened. Faith was meant to flow downward, from Terra through scripture, through sanctioned imagery, through ritual repeated until it became instinct. This faith flowed sideways. It moved through proximity, through shared exhaustion, through the intimate knowledge of having survived something that should have erased you. It was not taught. It was caught. A veteran sergeant described it later, during an interview never meant for public release. He said the legend did not make men brave. It made them heavy, anchored, like something had placed a hand between their shoulder blades and said, without words, not yet. The sergeant did not claim this hand belonged to the Emperor. He did not need to. Everyone listening understood the implication, and that was enough to make the transcript disappear into restricted archives. Command attempted to measure the effect. Not openly. Metrics were adjusted. Engagement durations compared. Break rates analyzed. Casualty curves examined for irregularities. The numbers refused to behave. Units exposed to the legend showed higher short-term survivability, but increased long-term psychological degradation. They fought harder, longer, and then broke more completely once removed from the front. Faith, it seemed, deferred collapse rather than preventing it. This was unacceptable. The Imperium could tolerate suffering. It could not tolerate unpredictability. Orders were issued, phrased carefully. Rotations accelerated. Units that had been present during the most intense phases of the war were redistributed across multiple fronts. Their shared experiences diluted. Priests were instructed to emphasize endurance as obedience rather than proximity. Commissars were given broader discretion to suppress non-doctrinal interpretations before they coalesced. The legend was not attacked directly. It was starved. Among the soldiers, this response affirmed everything. Stories sharpened in private, even as they softened in public. Details were stripped away until only function remained. You did not say the Emperor walked among men. You said the Emperor was close. You did not say he spoke. You said you knew when to move. The legend became less a story and more a rule of thumb. A battlefield heuristic passed quietly between those who had learned to trust it. But something else began to surface as well. Something darker and far less useful. In battles where the pressure was absolute and no reprieve came, where the line broke despite every effort, soldiers reported the opposite sensation. Not abandonment, not wrath, absence, a hollowing of the air where that weight had once been felt. Panic did not surge in those moments. Despair did. A cold understanding that whatever had stood with them before was not obligated to do so again. Those accounts never circulated widely. They died with the units that experienced them, or were buried under casualty reports too extensive to examine closely. But a few survived, carried by men and women who had lived long enough to be reassigned away from the worst fronts. They spoke carefully. They said the Emperor did not always come. They said sometimes the war was left to finish itself. And that was when the legend stopped being comforting. Because if the Emperor walked among men only sometimes, then his presence was not guaranteed. It was conditional. And no one could say what the conditions were. The ecclesiarchy never denied the legend. That was the most telling response of all. In an Imperium that crushed heresy with reflexive brutality, silence was not neutrality. It was selection. Sermons continued uninterrupted across the war zone, their language unchanged, their emphasis carefully orthodox. The Emperor was eternal. The Emperor was omnipresent. The Emperor protected through duty, sacrifice, and obedience. No mention was made of walking among men. No mention was made of absence either. The words were chosen to contain everything without confirming anything. Privately, the discomfort was palpable. Confessors attached to regiments began filing quiet addenda to their spiritual assessments, noting soldiers who displayed non-ritualized certainty under fire. Not zeal, not fanaticism. Certainty. The kind that did not rise with chanting or icons, but appeared spontaneously in moments of collapse. It unnerved them. Faith was meant to be cultivated, shaped, guided. This was faith without instruction, emerging fully formed in the crucible of violence. Commissars noticed as well. Discipline failures declined in exposed units, but so did responsiveness to coercion. Men who had once required the threat of execution to hold a line now did so without prompting and without fear. Orders were obeyed not because of authority, but because they aligned with something internal and immovable. The commissariat understood obedience. It did not understand concurrence. The adeptus administratum responded the only way it could, by removing the question from circulation. Reports referencing battlefield presence were reclassified under morale anomaly protocols. Data slates containing subjective language were archived rather than forwarded. Clerks were instructed to summarize outcomes, not impressions. Victory ratios mattered. Feelings did not. But doctrine could not account for what doctrine refused to name. In private chapels erected behind the lines, priests altered their prayers without authorization. Not overtly. Subtly, words emphasizing proximity slipped into litanies meant to emphasize transcendence. Soldiers noticed. They always noticed. The prayers spread faster than the corrections, carried by memory rather than text. And still, no custodian arrived. That absence echoed louder than any denial. If the Emperor had truly manifested, even as rumor, the Adeptus Custodes should have responded. They did not. No golden-armored guardians descended from Terra to investigate. No sealed orders arrived to declare the matter closed. The silence stretched, and in stretching, it became its own statement. Speculation filled the vacuum, carefully framed as prayer or doubt rather than assertion. Some whispered that the Emperor's will could reach where his body could not. Others murmured that fragments of his attention wandered the galaxy like pressure fronts, felt but never seen. These ideas were never spoken aloud in formal settings. They existed in the same half-light as all dangerous thoughts, expressed only in murmurs and immediately denied if repeated. The ecclesiarchy tolerated this, because it had learned a brutal lesson over millennia. Faith that could not be controlled could still be useful, provided it did not organize itself. The legend remained diffuse. No sect formed. No banner was raised. No saint was declared. The story continued to exist only where war stripped people down to the bone, where belief became less about salvation and more about function, and that, more than any miracle, made it acceptable, because Imperium did not fear gods. It feared alternatives. The most dangerous aspect of the legend was not that it challenged doctrine, but that it required no revision of it. Everything the soldiers felt could be folded, if one tried hard enough, into existing belief. The Emperor was everywhere. The Emperor saw all. The Emperor guided his servants through trial. These were truths repeated since the earliest days of the Imperium. The problem was not contradiction. It was intimacy. Faith, as the Imperium practiced it, was meant to be vast and impersonal. The Emperor was a sun, distant and blinding, his light reaching all but touching none. What emerged in this war felt smaller, closer, uncomfortably near. Soldiers did not feel watched from above. They felt accompanied. That distinction mattered more than any heretical wording. Confessors struggled with it in private. Several recorded dreams they could not reconcile with liturgy, visions of standing in empty chapels where the Emperor's iconography loomed overhead, silent and immense, while something unseen stood beside them instead. They woke shaken, unsure whether they had committed blasphemy, simply by imagining such proximity. No formal penance was assigned. The dreams were noted and set aside, as if the ecclesiarchy itself did not wish to decide what they meant. Among the rank and file, the silence from authority became permission, not to speak openly, but to believe quietly. Faith became inward-facing, stripped of ritual excess and focused entirely on endurance. Soldiers stopped praying for survival. They prayed for steadiness, for the ability to stand when standing mattered more than living. In this way, the legend reshaped devotion without ever naming itself. The absence of custodian intervention continued to gnaw at the edges of thought. Every soldier knew the stories. The Adeptus Custodes did not move without reason. If they were absent, then either nothing had happened or something had happened that could not be addressed. Neither possibility was comforting. Speculation remained carefully indirect. Some framed it as a test, spoken in the language of sermons rather than theories. Others suggested, in murmurs quickly smothered, that the Emperor's attention might not be singular, that his vast will brush reality in places of greatest strain. These ideas were never written down. They were passed like contraband, always prefaced with denial, always followed by silence. The Imperium allowed this because it recognized the alternative. If the legend were declared false, it would become defiance. If it were declared true, it would become uncontrollable. Silence preserved usefulness, and usefulness was the only virtue that mattered. As the war finally began to wind towards something resembling conclusion, the legend did not resolve. It did not crescendo into revelation or collapse into disproof. It simply thinned, stretched across too many fronts as units were rotated away. Survivors scattered, memories diluted. The pressure that had defined the war eased, and with it, the sensation many had come to rely upon. Some noticed its absence immediately. Others did not realize what was missing until weeks later, when fear returned with unfamiliar sharpness. A few wrote to confessors asking what it meant that they no longer felt steady. The responses were careful and unsatisfying. Faith was not a feeling. Endurance was a choice. The Emperor tested his servants in many ways. None of those answers fully explained why the war had behaved the way it did. Chapter 4 closed without declaration or denial, leaving behind a doctrinal void carefully maintained by silence. The Imperium did not name what had happened. It did not enshrine it. It did not erase it either. It simply moved on, carrying the legend forward not as truth, but as residue. And in doing so, it ensured the final question would not be theological at all. It would be practical. The war ended the way most Imperial wars did. Not with victory, but with stabilization. Front lines hardened into borders that would be argued over for decades. Supply routes reopened just enough to justify the casualty expenditure. Command declared the campaign a qualified success, a phrase that meant the Imperium had not lost anything it could not replace. The planet remained scarred, half ruined, but productive enough to matter. That was all history would record. What history would not record was what lingered after the guns fell silent. Survivors were processed with the same efficiency that had governed their deployment. Regiments were broken apart, veterans reassigned, units with shared experience scattered across sectors that would never speak to one another again. This was standard procedure, but in this case it served an additional purpose. Memory disperses when community dissolves. Legends starve when they lose witnesses. Those who had felt the presence most strongly noticed the change first. Removed from the pressure of constant combat, the sensation faded quickly, like warmth leaving a body after death. Fear returned in small, intrusive ways. Hesitation before routine drills, flinches at harmless sounds, doubt where certainty had once been. The men and women affected did not speak of it openly. They assumed it was weakness returning. They were wrong, but no one corrected them. In rear garrisons and transit worlds, the stories changed shape. Stripped of immediacy, they lost detail and gained symbolism. What had once been described as a pressure, a presence, became phrased as inspiration, courage under fire, the Emperor's unseen guidance. Safe, approved language. The Imperium was very good at sanding down the dangerous edges of truth until it fit inside doctrine. And yet, the story never vanished. It resurfaced whenever war reached the same level of desperation, on different worlds, in different sectors, among soldiers who had never heard of the original campaign. The details never matched. They did not need to. The function remained consistent. At the moment when collapse felt inevitable, something changed. Men stood when they should have fled. Units held when they should have broken. Time was bought where no time should exist. The Imperium noticed. Not officially. Officially, these were unrelated morale phenomena, coincidental overlaps in human psychology under stress. Unofficially, patterns were tracked. Not to understand them, but to account for them. Wars where such stories emerged were allowed to burn longer. Reinforcements were delayed just enough to see if endurance alone would hold. Sometimes it did. The Imperium learned a lesson it would never articulate. It did not need the Emperor to walk among men. It needed men to believe that he might, because belief changed behavior. It replaced panic with obligation. It made retreat feel like betrayal rather than survival. It turned endurance into something sacred rather than accidental. In a galaxy where manpower was the only resource that truly mattered, that was invaluable. The story was never canonized, never denied. It was permitted to exist in the narrow space between faith and rumor, where it could do the most work without demanding explanation. Soldiers who spoke of it were not punished, only redirected. Priests who hinted at proximity were not censured, only reassigned. The system adjusted, quietly and without admission. By the time the Administratum closed the campaign's final data vaults, the question of whether the Emperor had walked among men no longer mattered. What mattered was that the story had worked. It had kept the Imperium standing, when standing had no other justification. And that was reason enough to let it survive. There were soldiers who carried the story with them long after the campaign ended, though they learned quickly not to name it. In transit holds drifting between stars, in garrison worlds that smelled too clean to be trusted, they felt the absence more keenly than the presence had ever been felt. The war had stripped them down and, for a time, given them something solid to lean against. Now that pressure was gone, and without it, fear returned in quieter, more corrosive forms. Not terror in battle, but hesitation in safety, doubt in stillness. The unsettling sense that whatever had steadied them had done its work and moved on. Some tried to chase the feeling. They volunteered for redeployment, sought out the worst fronts, convinced that desperation itself was the key. They were wrong. The story did not obey desire. Others retreated inward, burying the memory beneath routine and ritual, repeating litanies until the words felt heavy enough to replace what had been lost. Most simply endured, carrying the residue of belief without knowing what to do with it. The Imperium counted all of this as success. From a strategic distance, the conclusion was unambiguous. Wars where the story emerged lasted longer. Lines held when they should not have. Losses mounted, but time was purchased, and time was the only currency the Imperium ever truly spent. The legend did not create victory. It delayed defeat. In an empire built on attrition, that distinction was everything. No official doctrine was amended. No archive acknowledged causation. But in the quiet spaces between campaigns, planners learned to recognize the signs. When soldiers began speaking less about fear and more about inevitability. When units reported clarity instead of morale. When desperation hardened into something unyielding. The Imperium watched closely, not with reverence, with interest. The story was never allowed to conclude because conclusions invite questions. Instead, it was allowed to persist as background radiation, a constant low-level belief that could flare under pressure and then fade without explanation. It belonged to no world, no regiment, no saint. It could not be invoked deliberately and could not be disproven cleanly. That made it perfect. Whether the Emperor had truly walked among men was, in the end, irrelevant. The Imperium had long since learned that truth was less useful than function. Faith that could not be verified but could be relied upon was more valuable than any miracle that demanded acknowledgement. And so the story remained exactly where the Imperium needed it. Not in scripture, not in history, but in the moment when a soldier should break, and does not. Somewhere, on some future battlefield already burning its way into relevance, another war would reach the same point of pressure. Another line would thin. Another stand would become statistically impossible. And when that moment came, someone would feel the air change, just enough to matter. They would not say the Emperor was there. They would only know that leaving was no longer an option. And the Imperium would endure, not because its God walked among men, but because it understood why men needed to believe that he could. The Imperium never writes an ending for stories like this. It lets them expire naturally, the way smoke thins once the fire moves on. No decree is issued. No archive is sealed with a final sigil. The campaign's data is filed. Its casualty totals absorbed into averages so vast they lose meaning and attention shifts elsewhere. Another world, another war, another set of projections waiting to be defied. The story survives anyway. It survives in the way veterans pause before stepping into fresh trenches, listening for something they cannot name. In the way orders are obeyed a fraction of a second faster when the situation turns impossible. In the way fear hesitates just once before doing its work. No one calls this the Emperor's presence. That would be dangerous. They call it resolve. They call it duty. They call it experience. But some remember how it felt when the war leaned hardest and did not crush them. Those memories are never shared in full. They are trimmed, made acceptable, reduced to phrases that pass inspection. We held. The line didn't break. Something kept us standing. Anything more precise would invite questions the Imperium does not want asked, because questions lead to doctrine, and doctrine demands answers, and answers create obligations. The Emperor, entombed upon the golden throne, remains exactly where the Imperium says he is. The Astronomican continues to burn. Terra continues to endure. Nothing official has changed. Nothing needs to. The truth, whatever it is, has been rendered unnecessary, because the Imperium does not require certainty. It requires continuity. It requires soldiers who will hold one more minute than logic allows. Officers who will commit when retreat would be safer. Medicae who will work past collapse because stopping feels unthinkable. Faith that does not demand miracles, only permission to endure. Whether the Emperor walked among men, in that war is a question that will never be answered, because answering it would diminish its value. A miracle explained becomes a relic. A miracle denied becomes a lie. But a miracle suspected, half believed, half feared, remains useful forever. So the Imperium keeps the story exactly where it belongs. Not on banners, not in sermons, not in history, but in the split second when a human being decides not to break. And as long as wars are fought by men and women who can still feel the hesitation, however briefly, the Imperium will continue to stand, carried forward not by certainty, but by the quiet, dangerous power belief left deliberately unresolved. That is why the story survives. And that is why it will never be finished.